Okay, I think we'll get started. Well, good morning. My name is John Cleveland, along with my colleague Amy Longsworth. We staff the Boston Green Ribbon Commission. Hello to friends, colleagues, and visitors into our interactive program series on the Seaport Resilience Report deep dive. I think it's particularly appropriate right now, given that resilience is on everybody's mind with the crazy fires out in the West Coast that have burned over 5 million acres, and Sally bearing down on the Gulf Coast. There was an article this morning said there have been so many storms this season that they're now running out of the names. So they'll have to increase their list of names just to keep the storms going. So I'm going to do a quick introduction of our panelists, but before I do, just want to note that as you are listening to their presentations and questions emerge to you, please put them in the chat box. We will have at least a half hour at the end of this presentation to respond to questions and answers and have some dialogue with the panelists and with the audience members. And we'll use the chat box as a way of sort of keeping track of what the questions are. And hopefully we'll be able to get to as many of them as we can. So as questions emerge during the session, please put them in a chat box and we'll get to them at the end. Next slide, please. We have three great panelists. First up is going to do an intro to the Seaport report is Bud Riss. Most of you know Bud from his many decades of work in Boston on climate change. He was a founding member of the Green Ribbon Commission in 2010 when he was CEO of the New England Aquarium. Before that, he ran the climate program for the World Economic Forum, and before that, for 2 decades, he was the president of Union of Concerned Scientists. Bud has co-chaired with Brian Koop the Climate Preparedness Working Group for the GRC, which has provided input from the very beginning, including the design of the Climate Ready Boston initiative and all of the initiatives that have sort of come out of that work. So Bud's going to do a front-end overview of the report and its recommendations, and then he's going to turn it over to Carole Foster, who's the Urban and Community Resilience Practice Lead for Arcadis. Again, many of you know Arcadis. They did the original South Boston Climate Ready Boston Resilience Plan. They're a global engineering, design, and management company. They have 350 offices, over 25,000 employees, and they're headquartered in the Netherlands. And the great thing about working with Carole and her team has been that they are doing similar kind of work in many other cities in the United States of America. So we've been able to really pull from their best practice understanding from their work in other areas, and it's really helped us sort of think through about where we need to go next. And then finally, Carole Charnow, who's president and CEO of the Boston Children's Museum. I think many of you probably taken your kids through that museum, and she's here as a property owner that's really in the middle of the work that needs to happen in Fort Point Channel. And she is going to talk in some detail about the design work that the museum itself has done and how that fits into the overall resilience strategy for the Seaport District and for the rest of South Boston. So those are going to be our three panelists. Again, a reminder, as you have questions, put them in the chat box and we'll move ahead. So with that, Bud, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, John. Good morning. Everybody hear me okay? Great. So I'm delighted to be here this morning. Those of you who can see my photo in Fort Point Channel with the Children's Museum milk bottle behind me can look at the sky, and that gray day is somewhat like the sky I'm looking at from where I am in Gloucester this morning. Apparently the smoke from California is in the upper atmosphere and making our sun an odd red color, which it takes up from what John was talking about, how we're fighting sort of twin climate battles across the country right now, reminding us what this issue is all about. So I think most of you know about the Green Ribbon Commission. We've worked very closely with the city of Boston from the beginning of the Climate Ready Boston project, which is now, I think, in its 5th or 6th year. We helped the city design the project in the beginning. We've sat on a number of steering committees on the various initiatives related to Climate Ready Boston over the last several years. And then sometimes the Green Ribbon Commission organizes its own studies. You may remember a couple of years ago, we commissioned the study on the feasibility of a barrier across Boston Harbor, which basically said, take that off the table for now and come back and revisit it in a couple of decades or so. And then more recently, we thought it would be a useful idea to do a follow-on study to the city's Seaport South Boston Resilience Plan that came out in 2018 to take a closer look at sort of the aftermath of that work and get a better handle on what was happening in the Seaport area, what are some of the gaps and barriers missing in terms of implementing the concepts that came out in that South Boston study, and what we could do about that, mostly looking at governance issues. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We had the good fortune of having Arcadis as our consultants of that project. So I'm going to do an introduction and sort of run through the first part of the report, and then Carly will pick up from me. And then I think we'll have Carole with a very good example of some of the challenges that people or property owners face in that part of the city to make their properties and everything behind them more resilient. So let's get started. Next slide, please. As I said earlier, there were really 3 sorts of questions that prompted this work. We wanted to get a handle on a better understanding of what flood protection actions are already underway or not underway by individual property owners in the Seaport area, again, following up from the South Boston plan that came out in 2018. We want to take a look and figure out where and why there are gaps in the work that's being done or not being done. And then most importantly, make some recommendations to the city on the governance, funding, and regulatory changes that may be needed to advance this work on a quicker pace, and to look at the kind of collective actions that may be needed to make that happen. Next slide. I was reminded in seeing all the coverage of Bob Woodward over the last several days, and I'm old enough to have been around at the Watergate era. And in those days, the key to the investigation was follow the money and you'll figure out where the problems are. Well, today it's follow the water. And if you remember this map, those of you who have looked at the South Boston Resilience Plan, the flood pathways are really key to understanding who, what, and where will be vulnerable in that part of the city. And if you look at the map, this map's 40 inches of sea level rise, as well as other scenarios over the next several decades between now and 2070. You see that there are a lot of arrows coming out of the 4-Point Channel area and also Seaport Boulevard. So those are the areas that are the sort of 2 most critical near-term flood pathways in the Seaport area. And that led us to focus on 2 segments of the entire South Boston area. Next slide, please, which were the focus of this work, 4-Point Channel and Seaport Boulevard. The 2018 South Boston Resilience Plan identified about $35 to $50 million worth of work needed in each of these 2 areas, most of it to be done in the next 5 to 10 years. I think the first deadline is 2025, which is now only 5 years away. And if any of you have been involved in the conceptualization, the design, the permitting, licensing, and construction of any projects like these, particularly in the water or near the water's edge, you know that that can be a multi-year process. So the clock is ticking, and we felt it really important to look at these 2 areas and see what we could do to figure out how to help move things along. Next slide, please. So in the broader context of the entire South Boston Resilience Plan, these are 2 areas out of several around the waterfront in that part of town with total costs of $500 million to $1 billion. And then if we think of the various neighborhood plans that the city has done around the entire waterfront of the Inner Harbor, we're probably looking at $2 billion. I think I would now confidently say to $2 to $4 billion worth of work that has to be done around the entire waterfront to make the neighborhoods, to protect the neighborhoods and the people living and working in them from the flood projections and sea level rise that we now think is going to occur over the next several decades. So these are big projects, and we're starting at 2 areas that are sort of 50 to 100 million each, but keep in mind a lot of what we looked at in this study, I think, is applicable to the city as a whole, all around the waterfront. It's a very much more complex task than just these 2 areas, of course. Next slide, please. So we did a number of things for this piece of work. There were really 3 components to this project. One was, and I think kind of the heart of it, was interviews with 13 or 14 of the major property owners and some of the tenants in these 2 parts of the city. And you'll see the stars here along 4-Point Channel and Seaport Boulevard. We also asked Arcadis to look at what other cities are doing around the country, and in the report, you'll find a number of case studies. I think what's important to keep in mind, though, this is kind of a new issue for many urban areas across the United States, like Boston, facing sea level rise and future flood risks that they haven't experienced before. So it's a new challenge in many ways. And although I think a few cities are now tackling this quite vigorously, there really isn't 20 years of history that you can fall back on to figure out how to do this. Of course, many places have experienced flooding in the past, but the challenge that we're facing now is indeed quite new, not only in Boston, but elsewhere around the country. You'll also find in the report that we took a look at the regulatory environment, particularly those that are under the control of the City of Boston, and we made some recommendations about how the regulatory environment and some of the measures that are used to permit waterfront development need to be updated to get some consistency across the processes, and I'll come back to that in a little while. But I want to focus on the property interviews because I think it was quite interesting and quite revealing about the current situation. Next slide, please. And this is a little hard to summarize just in one slide, but let me try to do that. I think the good news is that virtually all the property owners we talked to in the Seaport are aware of the flood risks, and I think that's a result both of the Climate Ready Boston study and the major flooding. You remember there were 2 nor'easter storms that flooded that area in 2018. So that was a real wake-up call. And the extent of that flooding very much validated the flood pathway maps that I showed you earlier. So, and I think that was a real wake-up call, and I think made very clear what the maps were showing to everybody. We also found that several people in the area are moving forward with implementation. That's particularly true for property owners that are developing new properties where the land is vacant or has been parking lots for many years, particularly along the 4-Point Channel area towards Gillette. Others who tend to have existing developments, sometimes with their windows even touching down into the water, had a little bit more of a wait and see attitude. They were unclear about some of the city's resilience plans. They want to know more about what adjacent property owners are doing. And they particularly want to know what kind of upgrades the city and state are planning to their infrastructure. So there's a combination there of several property owners ready to get moving and know what they want to do, others a little bit more in the wait and see. Many property owners pointed to the need for collective governance and funding solution that's both fair and equitable. And by that, I mean fairness in terms of making sure people who might be protected inland by work that shore owners are doing, and equitable. Some people have the ability to pay and some people don't, and we need to figure out how to deal with that going forward. Several of the owners, particularly those property owners who are developing brand new buildings on vacant land, are quite willing to pay for the solutions on their properties. And I think we're seeing that already underway with what Related Beal and National Development and some of the other property owners there along where Gillette is located. They want to get going. They're building $500 million to $1 billion projects, and spending $5 to $15 million on flood protection, frankly, doesn't scare them. Nearly everyone we spoke to, and I think this is the most important finding, saw a need for more coordination, particularly across contiguous properties. There was some confusion about what the target flood elevations are that everybody is supposed to design to, and there was a particular concern about making sure everybody was tying in across contiguous properties. This is a very similar issue that came up in the discussion of the Pinnacle building and the Chaffaro project. just the other night in a very big hearing that was held about that property over on Central Wharf and Long Wharf, where one of the key issues is how is everything going to fit together in a single line of defense, whether that's berms or walls along the waterfront or whatever. So that's really important. We also, another finding that's not in here is that there is great reluctance to go out into the water. You'll remember that the mayor's Resilient Boston Harbor plan called for as much as possible sort of a design by nature approach, or what others call living shoreline, with a lot of green park space going right down into the water around much of the waterfront. I think we learned, which was actually not a surprise in this project, that a lot of the developers, particularly those developing new properties, are reluctant to get involved with that as much as they would like to do so, because they see a really burdensome regulatory process and they don't want to be slowed down. Keep that in mind as we get to Carole's presentation later, where I think they've come up with a rather bold plan, and they'll have to deal with that, but I think they're really interested in exploring how to do that because they see a lot of benefits going forward. I think one of our other key conclusions is that we think it's possible to get this work done, or the work that's called for being done by 2025 along Fort Point Channel, by really trying to maximize the effectiveness of existing governance, regulatory, and funding approaches. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. It does not mean we can continue business as usual, but that we think that the work can be done if the city will take the right steps, and we've begun to engage them in a lot of conversation about what those steps are to get what's needed done. Having said that, as the work gets more complicated, as the complexity and the size of the scale increases, and as you look across all of South Boston, not just Fort Point Channel or Seaport Boulevard, but even the city as a whole, there's probably a need for a new governance structure to make happen what needs to happen if you think about that $2 to $4 billion worth of capital projects that need to get done, paid for in some cases by the public sector, but also by the private sector. And then coming back to my earlier statement that a lot of this is a new challenge. I think we also think this is not something that can just be kind of easily glommed on to the existing workload of our city of Boston, or even at the state level. But new resources are going to be needed. This is a new challenge, and we're going to have to deal with it properly and resource and fund it properly. So let me just summarize some of our key recommendations on the next slide, and then I'll switch over to Carole. So I think the first, picking up on what I just said, is that we've recommended the city that they need a new cabinet level position to coordinate the resilience implementation. I think between EEOS and the BPDA, they've done a fine job on a lot of technical analysis, the early Climate Ready Boston work to do the vulnerability assessment citywide. I think they've done a good job by and large on the neighborhood resilience plans, and they're about to finish one for the downtown and one for Dorchester. And then there's one more last neighborhood study to be undertaken that will look at some gaps that weren't done early on in the Charlestown and East Boston area. But as I mentioned, there's probably 75 to 100 projects that are coming out of all of that work that call for implementation, some by the private sector, some by the public sector, and some by both sectors over the next couple of decades. And that's a big job. The scale of it, we think, requires new positions at the city with sufficient resources to get the work done. Secondly, and this gets to some of the confusion that we heard from a lot of the property owners about, what is the fate of these neighborhood plans, particularly the one in the Seaport and South Boston that was done. What is their real impact? Are they binding or not binding? How do we make sure that the standards and recommendations in that plans are used going forward? So we recommended the city that some mechanism has to be developed to sort of formally adopt and embody these plans in the planning and regulatory apparatus in the city. You may remember Imagine Boston 2030, which was the biggest comprehensive plan the city had done in, I think, 50 years. That was formally adopted by the BPDA board. And we think something like that needs to be done to these plans to make clear that these are now going to be used as planning and regulatory and design guidance in the Seaport and elsewhere around the city. Along with that, it's critically important to integrate the design and performance standards from these plans into the existing regulatory mechanisms across the board, including the new flood overlay district zoning that the city is working on and is about to now restart after a sort of 5 or 6 month hiatus because of COVID. There's a lot of discussion about whether to allow fill and not allow fill for resilience purposes along the waterfront. But I think there are other issues that are critically important, some that I've mentioned earlier. We got to be real clear about the target elevations we're going to ask everybody to design to, and real clear about the expectations for what we call tie-ins across their properties to get the contiguous line of protection that we need in each of these areas. And we think there's an opportunity to get all of that consistent and nicely aligned in the flood overlay zoning work that the city's doing, in a new wetlands ordinance for which they'll be developing regulations shortly, and in Article 80 and Article 37, other measures that the city used to regulate at least large development across the waterfront and elsewhere in the cities. Fourthly, we think there's a real need to get real clear about what will be expected of the private sector and what will be expected from the public sector in terms of sharing the costs of these projects going forward. One thing that we recommend for the Seaport area, since the work has to get done fairly soon, very quickly, is that the city could develop an MOU with each of the major property owners along the waterfront to clarify what's going to be expected of those property owners in terms of the scope of work and in terms of who's going to be expected to pay and where that source of money might come from. I think that's a little bit easier in the Seaport, where you have very large and very sophisticated property owners. As you get into East Boston and Charlestown and other parts of the city where there's much more existing development, much of it much smaller scale, the equity issues are much more complicated. And particularly now with the rise of the social justice issues, I think we're going to have to look a lot harder at how the cost sharing will have to work in each of those areas. And Carole is going to explain the cost sharing experiment we did in this area, which I think you'll find really interesting. But all of that has to lead, I think, to clarity about who's going to be expected to pay from the public side and the private sector as we go forward. We also recommended implementation of an idea that originally came out of the original Climate Ready Boston work, which was to create an infrastructure coordinating committee involving key city agencies along with key state agencies. I'm very happy to find out in just the last several weeks, the state has more or less done that at the state level with a new task force that is now coordinating climate change impacts and infrastructure development across all key state agencies and their assets. So I think it is a lot easier now for the city to figure out how to coordinate what they want to do amongst their public agencies and infrastructure, whether that's Boston Water and Sewer or the City Highway Department or whatever with the state. But we found a particular need here in this part of town that more coordination and joint planning is needed between Massport and the city of Boston, particularly because there is not yet agreement along Seaport Boulevard on exactly where the flood protection alignment needs to be. So that recommendation refers specifically to try to get the city and Massport and encouraging to work together more closely as we go forward. There's no silver bullet or single source of money that can be utilized for these projects. So we think it's really important to continue to work at the state and federal level to leverage whatever sources of money can be found. And Carole may want to talk a little bit more about this, but the feds are actually moving in a direction that I think is going to create a bigger pot of money to prepare for disasters rather than to pick up the pieces afterward. So we should look as we go forward to that. And then just to say, finally, we think that most of what we did and what we found for the Seaport is applicable to the rest of the waterfront areas around the city, keeping in mind that the nature of development in the Seaport is quite a bit different than what's happening elsewhere. A lot of it is new versus existing development. And as I said earlier, a lot of it is big, major development projects rather than dealing with double and triple deckers that have been there for 50 years or more. And the equity issues are very different as you look around the waterfront. But we think a lot of the governance measures are applicable statewide. And then I'll finish with just one last slide. Just to give you an idea, if you'll switch forward one slide, you know, the kinds of things we're talking about that a senior level cabinet position could do for the city. You'll see the word coordinate throughout these bullets. And that's the really important thing, to make sure not only the city agencies are coordinated around implementation as we go forward, but the city and the private sector players are also well coordinated to get the work done, particularly the work that needs to be done in the next 5 to 10 years. So I'll stop there. I think we're going to do Q&As after we all get finished. And I hope everybody, I didn't go too fast, but I'll flip over to Carole. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Bud. And just a friendly reminder, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. We do have some questions we're going to lead off with the panelists, but the sooner we get the questions in there, the better we can organize them. So I'm going to turn it over now to Carole, who's going to zero in on some of the long-term recommendations that build upon the short-term recommendations that Bud laid out. Carole?
Thanks, John. And you can move to the next slide. So one of the things that you'll notice is that our recommendations take place in sort of two parallel tracks, one to address the near-term needs, one to address the long-term needs. But really what's important to share is that they both have to be initiated now in order to meet both the near and the long-term needs. And then speaking quickly to what Bud mentioned about new federal funding, there is a program called the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program. It's got about $550 million available in that pot of money nationally this year. The application period opens up September 30th. And that's a brand new program. It's really exciting. It's an expansion on the pre-disaster mitigation program, which the city applied for portion of the funding for Fort Point Channel last year. And then also the flood mitigation assistance program is open during the same time period. That's also an annual program, and that has more money in it than we've seen in the past. So moving into kind of my portion of the presentation, I'm going to touch base on some highlights of possible answers to 3 key challenge statements. The question of, 1, who should be paying how much, when, and how, that Bud raised. 2, how might these projects be delivered and maintained from a practical perspective? And 3, what governance model might effectively ensure successful project implementation and maintenance over the long term? These questions are perhaps a bit different from the ones we usually ask about risk and what sort of coastal infrastructure solutions might be most appropriate. And Carole's going to talk about those in a little bit. But these questions are really just as critical, if not more so in some ways, because the answers will determine what we are actually able to accomplish together and for whom. Next slide. So the first question of who should be paying how much, when, and how to help implement coastal infrastructure should be paired first and foremost with the question of how might we allocate the cost share for these improvements in a fair, equitable, and transparent way. Our initial working hypothesis moving into this study was that a risk and benefits adjusted approach to cost share, who would pay, may be a viable response to that question. And at its most simple, this means that any given possible payer's share of the overall project costs, what would they pay, would equal or be roughly based on their share of project benefits in the form of losses avoided, risk mitigated, and even value added, with exceptions to that rule based on need. So for example, if the project cost was $100 and I own 20% of the total risk that could be avoided by the project and it was affordable for me to do so, then I might pay $20 toward implementation. So using South Boston as an initial experiment, we first calculated flood losses per structure across all of the neighborhood, across 16 flood scenarios from the Boston Harbor model. We brought in direct impacts like direct physical damage, business interruption, displacement costs, and expected human impacts that we calculated for the Climate Ready South Boston study. And the assessment assumed the rate of sea level rise outlined in Climate Ready Boston and the other district-related reports that the city has released. And we use that to determine the probability, the chance that each flood scenario might occur in any given year. We then annualized those losses. That means that we multiplied effectively the probability times the consequence to determine risk for buildings, facilities, and recreational park space based on anticipated risk with 40 inches of sea level rise. And that's what's expected over the course of the next 50 years or so. That also matches up with what we often refer to as the project useful life when assessing benefits of major infrastructure. So we think that we could go 50 years before we have to do something major to upgrade it. So when you sum up all of the risk across the entire neighborhood, it's really simple arithmetic to determine what share of risk is experienced at any given location or any given property. And we scheduled out the costs of the infrastructure to be shared and determined. So if we were to use this approach to allocate cost share, how much each potential payer category, building type, or even individual might end up paying toward the coastal infrastructure solution, not including any grant support. So we looked at scenarios for static annual payments and possible changes in payments over time based on project capital improvement schedule. And we looked at this both with and without financing and included long-term maintenance costs. So really like the maximum amount of money that would be required to implement all of these projects in South Boston. Next slide. So what you're looking at are payment or contribution share results summarized based on broad payer type. How much of the total project capital and maintenance costs might each payer type be responsible for? So in a big world of big data, there are many ways to slice up information to help you interpret the results. And this slide is really dividing payer types up across state, city, federal, private sector, and educational institutions based on ownership of property in South Boston. You'll also note that there is a chunk of costs undefined in the current pilot, and I'll get to that in a moment. So based on our initial assessment, which we plan to refine, private property owners and tenants in South Boston share roughly 25% of the direct coastal flood risk that would be mitigated through implementation of the Climate Ready Boston plan. And therefore, they would share 25% of the direct contribution toward paying for the solution. There's also a lot of state agency owned and operating assets in this area. And so we calculated roughly 25% of direct risk reduction would benefit various state agencies. We do believe that park loss costs could be a little overestimated. And so that's something that we'll look at. 10% to the city of Boston based on their direct risk mitigated and so on. And you'll see that the federal government only sees a small share here because the initial pilot looked predominantly at direct benefits. And these results would obviously change if we expanded to citywide. Ratios would shift by payer type because the neighbors have different land uses, ownership, and use types. So back to this sort of uncalculated area, this 40%. Direct benefits are those losses avoided that are most directly felt. That's what happens when you have, for example, impacts to the direct service population when emergency services and substations go down, when costs are incurred to repair a structure, to move to a new place, when business can no longer happen there. But there are other benefits, risks, losses avoided, and even value added that extend beyond these very direct impacts. Things like reverberating economic impacts through the city, through the region, through the national and state economy that we didn't include in the initial pilot because we're testing a hypothesis to see if it's worthy of further study. These are things like impacts to transportation, property value, and the value added benefits like social, recreational, environmental benefits of coastal resilience infrastructure. So based on similar studies, we estimated that there's roughly 40% of benefits of a more indirect nature where the payer would be more broad than just the property owner or tenant directly in harm's way. These are the benefits that extend to other parts of the city in addition to being shared across the direct beneficiaries of the neighborhood. These are the ones that would benefit the state and also potentially folks nationally. And they would be shared, those costs would be shared more broadly, and we're in the process of evaluating what that might look like. Next slide.
Hey, Carly, if I could just interrupt for a second, I'll let you catch your breath, just to say two things, just to make really clear, even though it's in the heading of the former slide. This is all of South Boston, not just the two focal areas along Seaport Boulevard and Fort Point Channel. And secondly, this is all an experiment. It's a sort of case study analysis. This is not a recommendation to the city about who should pay and how much. This was the beginning attempt to try to figure that out. And I just want to make that clear, because I was talking to a reporter last week who immediately went to how much is everybody going to be asked to pay. And that was not the goal here. This was to try this out, this sort of big data challenge out, and see if we could begin to figure it out. Thanks.
That's right. The question of like, could this process help us answer the question of who might pay how much?
Exactly.
Carly, just to highlight, remind the folks who are participating, there in the appendices part of the report, there's a fairly detailed written description of this cost share methodology that walks through each of the steps that Carly has been verbally describing. So if you want to sort of better understand it, go to the appendix.
Yep, read the report. That's what I think we're all recommending. So here you're looking at the beginning of an affordability analysis. So how might we begin to understand whether this approach could be affordable across different segments of the benefiting population? How might these costs compare to current costs already borne by people living in the neighborhood? And so what you're looking at is an example lens that we can use to look at affordability through. It compares the annual cost share by individual payer, and that's on the x-axis, to annual cost as a share of current estimated annual rent. So from our initial analysis, the majority of payers in South Boston, looking only at costs for coastal infrastructure in South Boston, would pay less than 2% of their estimated annual rent share toward the solution each year. And that does include parts of the South End that would be benefiting from the solutions as well. There are outliers, of course, but for every payer, the benefits in the avoided losses alone outweigh the costs. So each bubble that you're looking at is an individual private sector payer. And the colors are correlated to whether the structure use is residential, non-residential, or mixed use. And the size of the bubble correlates to the size of a structure. And you can see that in South Boston, we have structures as large as close to 8 million square feet. That's the largest, but that bubble at the top is about 216,000 square feet. So there's a huge range of structure size there. And as a general rule, the larger the structure, the larger risk share if the structure is located on or near the waterfront. But this still represents a relatively low cost if we're comparing it to current expected annual rent. And we're looking here at direct payment to the private sector because costs to utilities and public entities would obviously be passed on to those entities' service populations, potentially increasing costs to direct payers, but also allowing those costs to be spread out across broader populations, perhaps even those not necessarily located in the current and the future floodplain. I think this image is valuable, and Bud wanted to show it because it begins to help frame the conversation and potential actions around equity. There are a lot of benefiting buildings that might pay less than $5 a year. So then this raises the question of whether there should be a minimum payment among folks in the future floodplain in order to provide support to those less able to pay, while still ensuring that the benefits received always outweigh the payment contributed. Should there be a cap on payment amounts based so that nobody's risk really prices them out of being able to still live in the neighborhood? And assessments like this can begin to illustrate the need for that kind of support. And if we contemplate a payment structure that really provides a rational nexus between what you get out of the infrastructure and what you pay for it. Next slide. So I've really just scratched the surface of this assessment as you heard Bud and John really begin to highlight and caveat and where this is going or could go. But hopefully you're beginning to see some of the benefits of exploring this approach in more detail and potentially piloting it citywide, as well as integrating the indirect and other uncalculated benefits into the assessment. I've touched base on the rational nexus argument. There's not enough money in the state or city coffers to implement these necessary projects in South Boston, in the city, or in the region without redistributing current funds with sacrifice or providing additional sources of revenue or major grants, which we sort of touched on. Tying benefits to payments toward the solution can remove confusion, conjecture about the process, particularly when the calculations and their methodology can be communicated with real transparency. All methodologies that we used in this assessment stem from federal benefit cost analysis methods and also peer-reviewed studies. So they're all out there. Additionally, the data and the model can be updated actively, automatically recalculating costs and benefits that can be redistributed. So individual actions, for example, on behalf of property owners can be incentivized because it will reduce their risk and therefore cost share, though that cost share would never be fully eliminated because there would always be some level of risk remaining. So if grants come in, that can automatically reduce the overall amount of costs that have to be redistributed. And as we learn more about risk and sea level rise is realized over time, the model can be easily updated if that's what is ultimately desired. And different payers can also pay through different mechanisms. And so a future possible step in the analysis is to run different payment and funding mechanisms and to optimize affordability across all payers. Next slide. Our second and third question I'm going to touch on today are those surrounding project delivery. So this is the actual how and who of how a project moves forward with shovels in the ground and who will administer that, as well as the question of governance. The community-based public-private partnership model is an existing adaptable project delivery mechanism that can be nested within or be an arm of other governance frameworks. This model has been used by municipalities to implement and manage stormwater improvements in compliance with the Clean Water Act. A study related to our study completed by the city for East Boston and Charlestown project implementation also identified the community-based public-private partnership model as a possible approach for delivering district scale flood mitigation. And so essentially the municipality or governing entity would hire a private company or entity using a performance-based contract. That means that the private entity would serve as a master program manager and would be paid based on metrics that they meet. So that way the risk of the contract is shared between the governing entity and the private sector. This entity would deliver, operate, and maintain the infrastructure and associated programs with oversight by the governing body. But as more projects would need to be implemented over time, the current governance structure at the city would still need to be adjusted, and Bud touched on this, to accommodate the scale and magnitude of implementation. So even if a community-based public-private partnership model or even multiple were leveraged toward project delivery, we still need more over time and over the long term in order to manage the sheer magnitude and number of projects that have to go into place and be maintained. So we first began looking at the concept that has become known as the District for Resilience Improvements during Climate Ready South Boston, and variations on that same idea keep coming up. It was explored in the UMass Boston Sustainable Solutions Lab, Financing Climate Preparedness Report, and it was also included in the other study that I mentioned for East Boston and Charlestown. And in concept, that the DRI could be structured to coordinate with property owners and key stakeholders, take on debt, establish public-private partnerships, pursue grants, manage procurement, plan capital improvements, and also manage the long-term maintenance and enjoyment of the infrastructure. So the report, our report, explores possible scales and extents of the district, various configurations of it, and also at what scale, which contributions to the improvements would be made and distributed to address issues of fairness and equity. We could apply this model at the neighborhood level with a single coordinating citywide resilience committee, or there could be a single citywide district for resilience improvements that covers all properties within the extent of the expected flooding with 40 inches of sea level rise. So I'm going to focus for the next couple minutes on the citywide configuration. Next slide. So this is my last slide before I move on to Carole. So the citywide DRI framework would possibly create a new authority, utility, or commission. It would need to have authorities that span infrastructure, funding and fundraising, and all of the other responsibilities that I mentioned a little bit earlier. A single district for resilience improvements could realize certain economies of scale in the planning and delivery of coastal mitigation projects, and would aggregate decision-making around project priorities, as well as leverage funds from more well-resourced areas of the city, for example, to support less resourced areas. Conversely, the aggregated decision-making could unintentionally rob sub-areas of the city of autonomy or self-determination. That's a lot of what we've been talking about, that individual neighborhoods have individual needs. And so one possible approach may be to have subcommittees by neighborhood. That was actually a recommendation of Climate Ready Boston. So we think this approach could address a lot of need that's been identified in previous studies, and also that we identified through the research in our study. And the community-based public-private partnership model could be one project delivery approach used within the DRI framework to advance implementation. Then the risk-adjusted cost share approach that I walked through could provide an equitable and transparent rational nexus to raising funds to implement those critical projects. So I'll turn it over to Carole now to talk about the next phase of work at the Boston Children's Museum.
Great, thanks, Carly. And just again, a reminder, if you have questions, pop them into the chat box. And before Carole jumps in, I also want to note that Carole is the co-chair of the Green Ribbon Commission's Cultural Institutions Working Group, which is 40 cultural institutions we brought together who are working on shared action on climate change, both adaptation and mitigation. So in addition to her role as a key property owner here, she's also a leader in extending this thinking to the other cultural institutions in the city. So Carole, great to hear your perspective as an individual property owner in this space.
Thank you, John. And thank you very much for inviting me today. Bud's and Carly's remarks are very pertinent to the Children's Museum. As you can see, there we are right on the Fort Point Channel, at the mouth of the channel. Our footprint spans between Congress Street and Seaport Boulevard. So we have an awful lot at stake here as it relates to flooding. Some time ago, we embarked upon a master plan. We're not ready to announce the final plan yet. We'll do that sometime in 2021. But we've been working very diligently with our partners that I'll talk to you about to create a master plan that would not only protect our museum, our 178,000 square feet of property that we own, but also the neighborhood. So, what I'm going to show you today is just about 10 slides. We're going to breeze through pretty quickly, just to give you an idea, a taster of the direction that we're going. And so how we're going to try to tackle some of these problems. Of course, the issue of cost sharing and funding that Carly just spoke about at length are absolutely critical for us, as we're a nonprofit and we do not have the funds like the developers do to actually get this work done. So please go to the next slide. Here you can see this was Storm Riley in 2018. What you can see is that the water was up within a few feet of our plaza. What you can't see from this picture is that on Sleeper Street, which is the back the street behind the museum, we were completely flooded. In fact, we became an island for a period of time during that storm. Fortunately, the museum itself is slightly higher, so we didn't actually get any flooding into the visitor area, but we did get flooding into some of the doorways and some of our facilities areas. So this is an imminent risk and something that we're extremely concerned about. Next slide, please. So what we've really decided to attack with this is really looking at where we're going to be in 2070. And you know, as we've discussed, you know, we're going to try to get up to 14 feet. This is what the city recommendation is currently. And the issue for us really is around engagement. As Bud talked about this idea of a living shoreline, you know, it's one thing to just put up deployables and walls and so forth, but that's not really going to further our mission. It's not going to engage our children and families in the interests and study of climate change and how they can participate. So our challenge really is about how to mitigate this, this threat at the same time to preserve our mission and to follow through on the city's vision for a really vibrant living shoreline that features the water as opposed to just sections off the water from the public. And this you can see this great slide that really shows you where we're going in terms of water into our site. Next slide, please. So this gets back a little bit to what Carly was talking about. You know, you can see that in the lower right-hand corner of this slide, that orange section is really our footprint. So we are, again, from Congress Street, the Congress Street Bridge, to the Seaport Boulevard Bridge, and of course we encompass Martins Park as well. So we have 355 feet of property along the waterfront there that is essentially the gateway to 40,000 people, 5 neighborhoods, and over 5,000 buildings. So this is why this problem is not only our problem, and the real question of how we're going to get this work done and how we're going to cost share, as Carly spoke about, is really the question that's foremost on our mind. Next slide. I mentioned to you that we're working with some extraordinary partners. We engaged with Sasaki, and I know Kate Took and Zach Christo are on this call. They actually put together a really fantastic team, a number of civil engineering firms. We had Arup, Haley Aldrich, Moffitt and Nickel, VHB, and Turner Construction. So altogether, we've done a tremendous amount of analysis of what the challenges are. I just thought it would be fun for you to see a little bit of our seawall. There we are. You can see that we have some a big hole there in one area, but basically our seawall bridge to bridge is in pretty good to fair condition, and there's no severe defects. We do have some piles that we need to address, and that hole and so forth, but a really critical part of resilience on the Children's Wharf area is actually securing the seawall. So we've done a lot of analysis under there, and this work is going to need to get done regardless. Next slide, please. So here we are today. This is kind of where we started. With our project with Kate and Zach and Sasaki. We have 40 inches of projected sea level rise by 2070, as we've been talking about, in a recommendation of increasing our level up to 4 feet higher. We are at 10 feet. You can see the harbor walk is there. It's quite a straight shot from one bridge to the other, and that's at 10 feet. So we really need to get up another 4 feet, and but you can see the stakes that there's a projected $8 billion worth of property damage behind us if we don't tackle this problem right away. So go to slide 7, please. So when we started this process, which I think was quite a few months ago, what we did was we kind of boiled down the project into 3 significant goals. So our significant goal to start with is activating our waterfront. creating a space for children and families, making sure that we were able to accommodate all the vibrant events that we do in front of the museum that I know many of you experience. Engaging the children and families in learning, in the experience of the waterfront, immersing themselves in playful discovery, our mission, and also leading in terms of increasing the resilience of the Fort Point Channel and the museum and protecting the surrounding areas. So these were our 3 guiding principles for our master plan. Next slide. What Sasaki did, which was really helpful to us, is, you know, there's an issue of a lighter touch, a cheaper project into a project that has more impact in terms of our mission and learning and engagement on the waterfront. There's a desire on the behalf of the museum and its trustees, a few of whom, by the way, are on this call, so hello to you. There's a desire to actually showcase the property that we have because of our mission and our leadership role in the city. The idea is we could actually demonstrate how these resiliency projects can really enhance and improve a city and make it these projects even a destination for people to come down and see how climate change can be addressed in the most vibrant way. So they created these 3 different projects. I'm going to show each of the 3 of them to you. The final master plan, which we'll announce next year, will actually be an amalgamation of all of them. But this gives you an idea of the direction that we are going to go. We have the vertical edge, the floating garden, and the Discovery Cove. Next slide, please. So this is phase 1, this idea of starting to address the Harbor Walk footprint, but it's really not doing too much in the water. This option would actually use a lot of deployables. You can see gaps where these seated architectural walls actually have gaps to get into the museum. We'd have to put up deployables in those areas. You can see there's a floating dock, and there's also a new 2-season pavilion there. You can see like a little blue awning. That's where we would be doing our events. The milk bottle is there over there on the right. By the way, we're restoring that right now. But this would be the least expensive option, and it would protect the museum, but really doing so with a lot of walls, not a lot of interest, not a lot of ways to get down to the water. But if need be, this would be the direction we'd go depending on the kinds of funding that's available. If you go to the next slide, the floating garden. So this is where we really start having some fun. You can see that we have opened up the space quite a lot, and now we're in the water. We have this kind of lengthy pier with a floating dock. We have all these little floating garden pods that can have all kinds of tide pools on them and all kinds of interest. There's a kind of berm where people can get down to the water. There's a larger pavilion for us. And now we have this area that's to the right of the pavilion, which is a kind of messy sensory area where kids can play with water, sand, and so forth. And we have less deployable space in this plan. We've also changed the entrance to the museum. One point I wanted to make really quickly is that when you raise the property, the front of the museum up to 14 feet, of course, you have to do something inside the museum. So as these different plans develop in their complexity and interest, they actually make it more expensive because we have to change the level of the floors in the lobby of the museum. So this is where it begins to become a little more complex. So why don't you quickly go to the last option? Now we're really building out. We have a whole little rocky shoreline. We've moved the milk bottle, which in the end we're not going to be able to do, but it would be fun to turn it into a big slide. You can see we have hanging gardens. we have a lot less deployables, and you can see that what we've done is with the sort of building up of the property that we don't have to have so many walls, and we've got a much bigger pavilion there that we can use, and this would be a very, very fun option for children and families. It could be a real showcase for the whole harbor, and encourage people to come down and really experience the water. There's really no place in the entire Boston Harbor where people can really get down right to the water and experience all that the beautiful Boston Harbor has to offer. So this is really where we start getting really excited about the options. If it were possible, as you can see to the upper left-hand corner of the picture, there's Martin's Park. It would be wonderful if we could work with the city to extend this look and feel further along the Harbor Walk to Seaport Boulevard. You know, that's all going to be a question of this contiguous work, as Bud was talking about, along the Fort Point Channel. Next slide. So really what we're going to try to do is mitigate flooding, protect the neighborhood, and also create a playful, engaging space for children and families and people who want to come down and experience the water, that have an opportunity for education around climate change and resilience, and really create this bridge-to-bridge destination for all in the city. And the hope is that we can showcase this, this area to really get people excited about flood mitigation, and rather than it being just something that we have to do, it's something that we want to do, and that we can provide a really enjoyable experience for our city residents and our tourists. So I think that's the end of my presentation. I think the next slide just says thank you. So thank you very much for asking me to join today and for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about our plan. And also thank you to Sasaki for guiding us through this really quite complex project that we have embarked upon.
Great, thanks, Carole. And thanks for that deep dive, because that just gives us such a great microcosm of the difficult choices that need to be made, and the trade-offs and the costs, and what it takes to have resilience projects actually enhance the quality of the city, which is the mayor's resilient harbor vision. So you can see why we started making the kinds of recommendations we did to build capacity in the city, because imagine multiplying this complexity, 50 or 100 times across the 40+ miles of our waterfront. That's what's going to need to get done. So thank you. As we transition into the Q&A, just a couple of quick things. One, this session was recorded, and we will be sending you out a link to the recording. In addition, we will be sending you a link to the slides that were used, and a link to the Seaport report documents on the GRC website, so you sort of have access to all the information. Two other sort of important resilience-related timelines for the city. Our understanding is the city is going to be releasing its downtown and Dorchester Climate Ready Boston plans, which will really fill out the portfolio of all 5 neighborhoods that these plans have been done for, which is just then really good timing to shift to the, okay, we kind of know what needs to be done. How are we going to actually do this? And second, the Boston Research Advisory Group that did the original consensus climate forecast for Climate Ready Boston is going to be issuing an update of that in 2021 to take into account all the new science. So just wanted you to know that those things are going to be happening. So we're going to move into the Q&A. Continue to put your questions in the chat box, but one of the questions that we did get, and Bud, I think probably best for you to answer this, was how has the city reacted to these recommendations, and what do you think the conversation with the city is about, and where is it about?
Sure, happy to take that, John. I also I also want to commend Carole and the Children's Museum for really running the tables on this various ideas they've put forward, perfectly exemplifying the kind of thing that I think the mayor and the city and many others would like to see happen, turning a challenge into an opportunity. And it's just great. And in addition, you're providing a lot of protection to everybody behind you. So who should help pay for it, by the way. So, okay. So, we've, with all of the Green Ribbon projects, we always work very closely with the city. We communicate regularly with them and try to, keep them in the loop of everything we're doing, because we share the goal of figuring out best how to get things implemented over time. So unfortunately, our report was released in about the second or third month of the COVID epidemic, as everything was really getting shut down and moving to Zoom and so on. So a lot of the city's climate work, including a detailed review of this project, got delayed a bit. But I will say that we've had several good meetings with the city, with very senior people in EEOS and BPDA. We've run through the report with them. We've explained our various governance recommendations, and I think they completely get the idea that more and better coordination is going to be needed going forward. I think that they get that completely. As I said, when they finish the Dorchester and downtown plans, they're going to have 75 to 100 projects that have to be coordinated over the next couple of decades. So I think they fully understand that, and they're looking at various options, including the ones that we've put on the table with them. Following the initial meetings with those two agencies, we had a very good session with the senior budget people in the city of Boston, who run the city's annual budget and also develop the capital plan each year, and also talk through these governance recommendations with them, particularly the idea of setting up a new senior position that would be fully resourced, and also the concepts that Carly talked about as ultimately moving from that to the kind of DRI approach we put in the report. A very good conversation. We have not yet heard back definitively where the city plans to go with these recommendations. And again, COVID kind of moved front and center. But I anticipate that in the next couple of months, we'll hear more clarity about that. So all I can say at this point is that our recommendations were very well received by the city. They get the need for more and better coordination, and I think they're working on the best way to do that.
Great, thanks, Bud. Hey, Lizzie, can you bring up the last slide in the slide deck? Because I want to just highlight it in case any of the participants need to leave before the end of the program. I just wanted you to know that our follow-on GRCx initiative, and this is a series where we're doing something once or twice a month, plan to be doing that through the end of the year and into next year, is really related to this issue that we're talking about in terms of cost share. It's going to be focused on how to price the impacts of climate change and link them to urban property values. And there are three great innovators in Boston that are right at the forefront of this sort of climate risk analytics movement. One of them is Delta Terra, another is RiskQ, and the third is Breckenridge Capital Advisors, is one of the largest investors in municipal bonds. And all of them are starting to actively use new methodologies for making this link. And in particular, RiskQ, which is a spin out of Northeastern, is working on the details of trying to figure out what the impact on property values is of making the resilience investments. So this is not just protecting from losses, but actually the long-term impact on the equity in the buildings, and how does that link to the return on investment, a sort of calculation for making those investments at the front end. So anybody who signed up for this will be getting an invite to it, and just wanted to highlight that because I think it's a really nice follow-on, particularly to Carly's really detailed description of the cost share analysis. And speaking of Carly, I have a question for you, and that is, since you do work, all across the globe and all across the United States, can you just give us a little picture of sort of how Boston compares to other cities? Are we ahead of the curve? We behind the curve? Are we sort of in the middle of the pack? And in particular to these two sort of large innovations that you that we really explored in this, the cost share and and a district for resilience improvement. Has anyone really done those and implemented it and sort of seen how it works? It'd be great to hear from you on that.
Thanks, John. You know, Boston is really an interesting case study and is unique in a lot of ways because it faces significant risk, but has largely escaped the type of major impacts that have been suffered by other high-risk parts of the country. So, you know, places like Florida and New York and Louisiana, who have in many ways been shocked into different types of decision-making. And Boston has sort of been watching those things happen and has developed an awareness and an urgency around its addressing risk without actually having had those kinds of impacts. And that puts you in a really unique position because you have not received the same level of federal investment and focus that other parts of the country have. You know, I mean, we're looking at billions of dollars of investment in, you know, Texas, Louisiana, Florida, from HUD money, from FEMA money, the Corps is investing. And so, you know, you've been, I think in a lot of ways, because of that, you are ahead of the curve in terms of thinking through how you're going to do this work in the absence of these kinds of huge federal investments. A lot of these other places are dealing with the politics of how to spend that money. They're dealing with the pressure of it. And a lot of the decision making is being driven by what's available to them, trying to address risk with what's available to them. But the gap, like this funding that they've been receiving, still leaves huge gaps between what their need is and what they've received. And so they haven't yet arrived at the same place that Boston is in terms of thinking about how you're going to fund, manage, and implement these projects over the long term. So in those ways, I really think Boston is ahead of the curve. I know it feels like it takes a long time. You know, you're building these plans. There hasn't been a huge amount of construction yet because you don't have that same level of investment, but there are really huge benefits to being prepared in this way because Boston is going to get hit. And when it's hit, it will be ready and it will be better positioned to focus the investment that would be coming from those disasters, and will hopefully have set up governance structures and funding structures so that you don't necessarily need it as a prerequisite to be moving forward with building resilience. Does that make sense?
Great, thanks, Carly. That's really helpful. And sort of there was a follow-on question from one of the audience that maybe a combination of you and Bud could speak to, and that is, if the city was going to move ahead on the establishment of a district for resilience improvement, what would the state role be, both in terms of sort of thinking more broadly than just Boston and thinking a little bit more the Boston Harbor region, and then also secondly, what kind of legal authorization would the city need from the state in order to set a new entity up? Could either of you speak to that? That would be helpful.
Maybe I can start, and Carly, you can pick up. Taking your questions in reverse order, John, I think there might be a need for new legislation to create these kinds of resilience districts that we're talking about here. You know, Massachusetts is a big home rule state, but usually to do these kinds of things, you end up having to go to the legislature. And I think that's probably the case, although Carly might comment on that. And then regarding the state role, Carly, correct me if I'm wrong, but the very big bubble on one of your charts to the right is the Mast Convention Center, the one that was 8 million square feet, which gets a lot of protection from what everybody, including the Children's Museum, does along the waterfront. So in this particular part of town, there's a state role to really, I think that we really have to all evaluate what's their responsibility to contribute to not only what we do along Fort Point Channel, but the Seaport area as a whole. There's also another big part of Carly's bigger bigger circle chart, I think, reflected the amount of land that DCR owns along the waterfront on other parts of South Boston, which needs to be protected. So they're a very big stakeholder in this part of the city. Beyond that, I think we really need their help in capital funding and particularly bonding. And, the governor has thrown out some options to do that through a real estate transfer tax. And there are probably many other mechanisms that could be developed. But I think funding from the state is going to be a critical piece, not the only one, but a critical piece of the funding solution.
Yeah, I do think that the DRI model could be applicable it's scalable. So it could be applicable at multiple scales, and it could be a model that the state could adopt for various jurisdictions. We do think that the mayor would have to file a home rule petition and secure approval by the legislature. We also think that, it will be a challenging and time-consuming process for the city and require a lot of public support. The state is a critical stakeholder, as Bud mentioned, as payer and as a payer, like a direct beneficiary, and also as, having more broad responsibilities in protecting kind of the citizens and communities. One of the things that we've had some conversations recently with members of a federal agency about basically who should bear some of the responsibilities for certain costs, specifically regional economic impacts and reverberating economic impacts. And we had some really interesting feedback that the perspective was that those would not necessarily be borne by the federal government, that when you're thinking about regional reverberating economic impacts, that may be a state responsibility. So the state, I think, is a very big stakeholder in this process, both in terms of the legislation piece, the implementation piece, and possible application, more statewide and enabling it at the jurisdiction level.
Great, thanks, Carly. It is worth highlighting here that the state of Maryland actually did pass legislation that authorizes municipalities and counties to create resilience authorities, and it specifies the powers that those authorities could have. It's an interesting legislative move because it does not involve massive state planning. It doesn't anticipate the state funding it. It just totally clarifies the legal question of whether or not localities have the authority to do that. We've shared that legislation with the city, and that may be something that the city will end up advocating for. There are two questions that are kind of related to fairness and cost sharing. I want to ask them together, and first to you, Carole, and then to the whole panel as a whole. So the first question to you, Carole, is, as the museum looks at these options, and I'm sure that these things are, priced in the tens of millions of dollars, do you have in your head any sort of, any kind of thumbnail sketch about what would be fair cost allocation between you as a property owner and the other beneficiaries? And then the second, which is broader to the panel as a whole, is seeing as the Seaport work is happening fast, how do you keep the needs of the Seaport District, which is a pretty wealthy area, from absorbing too much capital and making capital not available for less well-resourced communities? So Carole, could you just let us know if you have a point of view on that, and if the answer is no, that's fine too, but it would be great to hear from you.
I was so interested to hear Carly's strategy, because I think that's how we're going to have to think about this. I mean, it's so complicated. I mean, if we were able to get, say, some civic funding, federal, state, or city, to help with some of the more tactical aspects of flood mitigation, and then the museum were able to take care of its own challenges, that one wouldn't expect the federal government to help us raise the floor in the lobby of the museum. But then when you get into the issue of engagement of the residents of Boston on a living shoreline, you kind of ask yourself, whose responsibility is that? I mean, clearly it's the museums because that's our specific mission. But if we're the only family learning organization on the entire Boston Harbor, along with the aquarium, is that just our two responsibilities to make the waterfront accessible to the city? It just seems a little unfair that the city would have this wonderful grand vision of bringing the citizens of the city and the down to the waterfront, and yet the aquarium and the area where the Museum of Sciences and the Children's Museum were responsible. So it does start getting really complicated. And I think we've got a big, heavy lift ahead of us to figure out how what we're responsible to pay for and where we're going to be able to get partnership, not only with the civic agencies, but also our neighbors behind us in the 4 Point neighborhood.
Great, thanks. But there was one small sort of technical question that I think you'd be able to answer, because I think you've been part of this, is how does the plan in the 4 Point Channel area address the single rail bridge and the low points around the bridge?
Which bridge, John?
Uh,
The Northern Avenue Bridge?
I believe it's the Northern Avenue Bridge, yes.
Well, the Northern Avenue Bridge, and I was on the advisory task force for that for many years. They have, they're fully aware of the climate ready Boston work. They're fully aware of the target elevations of 14 feet and 4 Point Channel, and that's all being built into the way the bridge will be elevated, and that the ramps on either end of it will be designed, and so on. So I think there's a good level of coordination there. On the other end of the channel, it's really interesting. Carly mentioned including South End in the cost share analysis. That's because 4 Point Channel is a flood pathway into the South End. On the other end is the MBTA yard, at the far end of the channel. We've had very good meetings with the MBTA. They're also aware of their potential role here in blocking a major flood pathway to the rest of the city. Pre-COVID, they're working on looking at some of how to protect their key stations on the Blue Line, which are along the waterfront at the aquarium and in East Boston. And then I think are hoping at some point to move to a more sort of system-wide analysis, which would include that piece on the other end of 4 Point Channel. But the Northern Avenue Bridge very much understand the design for that, very much understands the risks in this area, and I think is looking very closely at how to address that and incorporate it in their design.
So, Bud, I just got a quick message from Dennis, who asked this question. He said it's not that what he's asking about. It's the rail line.
The rail line. Is that the MBTA that I'm talking about?
Well, if it's too complicated, we can do it offline.
Okay.
Okay. I did want to go back to this sort of fairness and cost sharing across the city issue, because it does relate to another question, which was, what are the next steps on this project? As Bud indicated, we are waiting to hear back from the city in terms of how they want to move forward, but we did make 3 very specific, in addition to the recommendations you saw, very specific proposals for next step analysis, and also offered to help the city raise some resources to do it. And those 3 components would be: 1, when the last 2 plans are out, in fact, aggregate all the projects, each of which has, across the entire city, there's somewhere between 50 and 100 of them, each of which has a different set of costs and a different timeline, into a master project schedule, and get to the next level of granularity about how the city is going to make choices on which projects it does when. And that gets directly to sort of the fairness and equity issue. And we know from other cities, if you're not intentional about it, the default criterion is going to be asset value, which then basically biases the investment to the most wealthy. So that's one thing we're recommending, and the city was doing some preliminary work on that, and is eager to move ahead on it. The second, as Carly indicated, is to extend this when we have the other two plans out, extend the cost share analysis to the city as a whole, because you can't really kind of understand how this cost share might work if you don't start to look at the interacting costs and benefits across all 5 neighborhoods. So that's another piece of analytical work that would need to be done. And then the last is to sort of go down to the next level of detail on the design of a district for resilience and improvements, and how would it actually be codified, what would the bylaws look like, how would it get structured, all that kind of detail. Some early thoughts of which are in the appendix, but that also would need to be laid out, and that would also have to clarify what kind of legal authority the city would need from the state. We are on 2 minutes before the end. I just want to pause and ask the panelists if there are any last points of wisdom you would like to share with the audience.
I think I'm good. I think we covered the waterfront.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much to the leadership of John and Bud and the Green Ribbon Commission, because trying to get out ahead of this is really a heavy lift, and it requires an enormous amount of coordination. And I think Carly and Bud really laid out some of the complexity of getting this going. And for property owners like us that really want to get started on it, we really need your help in helping us navigate this new pathway to getting ourselves protected. So I just want to thank you and look forward to working with you as we develop our plans and try to get a shovel in the ground.
Yeah, and as Bud, I think, has highlighted continuously, this is a new class of infrastructure that the city and the state have to build capacity to invest in the same way they have capacity to invest in all the other classes of infrastructure. And that's just work, and there's no way to do it without paying for it, and there's no way to do it without creating some new authority. So I think it's very clear that's where we need to go. Again, you'll get a follow-up email with connects to the materials. You'll also get an invite to our September 30th GRCx on climate risk and urban property values. Thanks to everyone for joining us this morning, and look forward to seeing you at the end of September. Thanks a lot.
And John, just before we close, I just wanted to also recognize my colleague Trevor Johnson that worked on the report with us as well.
Oh yes, yes. We could have not done this without Trevor. he was in the trenches doing those spreadsheets. So great. Thanks everybody. Appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you.